Welcome everyone to the Maximus call-in radio show, episode number 9. It's kind of nice that we've been continuing to have these on a consistent weekly basis, and so I look forward to joining with you, members of our Maximus community, to do any Q&A about interesting questions, challenges that you may be facing, and happy to hear from you all.
There's a question about transcendental meditation. What is it? And how does one get involved in meditation? Are there other types of meditation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question's around meditation, and particularly TM, which is kind of a branded form of meditation that was kind of imported here, I believe, like back in the 1960s or so, by a famous yogi. So in fact, if you are a history buff, the Beatles, which were the biggest phenomenon of the time, a UK-based obviously pop band, became kind of under the influence of one of these yogis and got really into meditation. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, if it's the same yogi that I'm thinking of, was the guy that also popularized Transcendental meditation, or TM, as kind of a way of making meditation accessible to Westerners. Because if you recall, meditation obviously comes from a religious tradition in the form of Buddhism, or in some schools of Hinduism as well. And so for folks who didn't necessarily want to change their religion altogether, but still wanted to benefit from the mental and physical health benefits of meditation, he kind of divorced it a little bit of the religious and spiritual background and kind of packaged it as sort of TM, or transcendental meditation. I'm not a practitioner of TM myself. I've heard some people talk about it, the most famous of whom is actually Jerry Seinfeld, who I think has been practicing TM for over 20 years now. And I believe the recommendation with TM is to practice twice a day for about 20 to 30 minutes. I heard Jerry actually joke that he's been practicing it like religiously, like once a day for 20, 30 years, and someone came along and said he was doing it wrong. So he was kind of bummed, because he was very proud of himself for being so adherent and such an acolyte of TM, where he goes around and sings its praises. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's a focus point meditation in which you practice focusing your attention on a particular point, which is usually the breath in most meditation practices. In some practices, it's a mantra that you repeat over and over again, which is kind of given to you by a guru. Or if you try to totally divorce it from the religious connotations, you can literally repeat any word, including the word one, which is what Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School did, because he wanted to kind of prove that there was nothing magical about the mantra. It's just the fact that you're repeating the same word over and over again, which forces you to pay attention to a single point. And obviously, as your mind strays from it, you kind of catch yourself with a spirit of gentle curiosity, and you come back to the breath or the mantra or whatever your focus point of attention is. There's lots of studies on TM and meditation in general as a beneficial practice. Obviously, it's very helpful for essentially training your attention, right? And so if you find yourself to be a person that is easily distractible, have difficulty sustaining attention, meaning paying attention for a long period of time, or you have difficulty with switching your attention. So you're switching from one meeting to the next, or switching from a meeting to heads down kind of work. It can be difficult for sometimes people to do that. And I think it's clearly beneficial as a form of mental training or focus training to do meditation practice. There are lots of other benefits as well, depending on the type. And that was one of the questions that this community member asked, is, are there different types of meditation? Yes, there are many, many different types of meditation. Another kind of branded type of meditation besides TM is something called MBSR, or what's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. It was developed by a colleague of mine, actually, Dr. John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And he actually would use it with patients that have some sort of chronic medical condition. So that could be folks that have cancer, psoriasis, chronic pain, and he would actually show that in a lot of times it would improve their ability to cope with the chronic disease, if not sometimes improve the disease itself. I believe there are in fact studies in psoriasis patients that show, an improvement even in like their skin from doing it. And the idea is in certain conditions, it's not that it's necessarily caused by stress, but it may be exacerbated or moderated by stress. So there may be a physiological cause or etiology to the issue that you're facing. Like for instance, it's not very true that stress causes cancer. There's usually a genetic, epigenetic, etc., component to it. But it may be that stress could exacerbate how one copes with cancer or the outcomes of certain treatments, etc., in terms of their immune response. So it's not to replace obviously mainstream medicine. You should obviously, do the standard treatments, but it can be a helpful complementary medicine to standard of care that can help you better cope with it. Just make sure you buttress your immune response and make sure that you're physically healthy. I think it's incredibly useful these days in a high pressure, high stress society. So another colleague of mine, Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, did a lot of the fMRI and I believe EEG kind of brain scan research on meditation, showing that it actually elicits changes in the brain as well. So in certain areas of the brain that are associated with certain things like increased well-being, you see in people who meditate on a consistent basis a change in their brain functioning to be associated with the types of patterns that you see with positive health and well-being outcomes. And what I thought was very clever is he went to, in one of his studies, a group of employees at a Wisconsin biotech company, because I think he's a professor at University of Wisconsin, if I recall correctly, and just taught them how to meditate for, I believe, a short period of time. I think it was around 30 days, and then measured sort of the effects on both their brain functioning and their well-being, and show that even in a very short span of time, in the span of about 30 days or so, I believe it was at least 1 month or to a couple months, in naive or untrained meditators, you're already seeing brain changes and improvements in self-reported or subjective well-being. So I really like that study because it kind of showed that, look, you don't necessarily need to be a Buddhist monk and measure, practice for 30 years. I'm sure they're very advanced and can do all kinds of things. In fact, in college, I worked at the Harvard Cognitive Neuroscience Lab and did studies with Mathieu Ricard, who's a very famous Tibetan Buddhist monk who has been practicing for 30 years. And he does have some special abilities. Like you can shoot a gun off next to his head and he has no startle response if he's trying to suppress that through a particular type of meditation practice. There's other types that are like an open awareness meditation, where instead of focusing on a singular point, you're just kind of taking in the surroundings around you. And I think that's the type that he uses when he's trying to, improve his emotional equanimity and not be as emotionally reactive in the test that we did. But the nice thing is, look, you don't need to become a monk and meditate for 30 years to find benefits. In fact, you may see benefits in as little as 30 days. So there are lots of schools of meditation. I think if you ask acolytes of any particular school or tradition, as I think you probably do with diets and things like that, everyone's going to say their type of meditation is the best. I don't think there's been rigorous comparative trials comparing different schools of meditation and showing a superiority, because it also depends on what are you trying to use it for. Are you using it to better manage your stress? Are you using it to better manage a chronic disease? Are you using it to fall asleep faster at night, which is what a lot of people are certainly using Calm and Headspace for. Or like I said, to improve your attention and focus. So it kind of depends on what the outcomes are. My philosophy, which is a very practical behavioristic philosophy, is, look, you should just find the method that you enjoy. It's accessible to you. Like, for instance, when I was a college grad, I just happened to be living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there was a Dzogchen, which is a Tibetan Buddhist school of meditation, who had a very prominent practitioner named Lama Surya Das, who's written lots of books. You can look him up afterwards, who was a teacher, and there was an open community free meeting, and they would teach you meditation every week. So it's not that I thought Dzogchen Tibetan Buddhist meditation technique was superior. It just happened to be convenient, and there was a good teacher around. So for very practical reasons, I ended up doing that technique, and that's what I was originally trained in myself in terms of my practice. And so that's what I would advise to other people. Find something that's accessible to you, and if it's something that gets you to do it on a consistent basis, that's going to be the best meditation technique, basically. Because I think what is clear from the literature is that consistent practice does seem to benefit not only meditation, but quite frankly, any training or practice that you're doing. So obviously, Headspace and Calm, 10% happier, simple habit, Oak, waking up, and mindfulness coach. I think I named like half a dozen different meditation apps that span from paid to free versions. I believe Oak and mindfulness coach are free if you want to just try out stuff before you go pay for a membership. Are really accessible ways of practicing meditation because you can obviously download it and do it whether on your mobile or your web. I know we have a caller, Bobby, who I don't know if he's here today, who has been doing Headspace, I believe, for over a year and found it incredibly beneficial. So just find what works for you. And even if you talk to the monks, they say that, 5 minutes of meditation is a day, or even 1 minute of meditation a day, but done on a consistent basis is much better than not doing it all. So that's the main thing I would recommend in the end too, is find something that you're willing to do and able to sustain long term. Because TM may be telling you need to meditate twice a day for half an hour and literally carve out an hour of your day. And I'm sure there's benefits to that, but practically for a lot of people, they're just not willing to do that, like Jerry Seinfeld for a few decades, and good for him for doing so. So if all you can do is 2 minutes twice a day, then stick to that and have that be a starting place for you in terms of developing that practice. Because I do think it is pretty clear that it is beneficial for the majority of people.
Yeah, no problem. This was an interesting post on the Discord. It was under our nutrition and supplements category. Any recommendations for a natural alternative to Adderall? I'm looking for something that will help me focus on my studies and test prep. I think I've got some adult ADHD. Thanks in advance.
Yeah, it's actually a great question. Well, first of all, I would say if you suspect that you have adult ADHD, it may not be a bad idea to consult with a professional and get a definitive diagnosis. Because if you truly have ADHD that's clinically significant, and by definition, that would mean that it's impairing, like it's getting in the way of your academic pursuits, it may be useful to actually get formally diagnosed. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of standardization in how ADHD is diagnosed because, it can be based on just a clinical interview. And, there's a lot of physicians that will do an intake, do an assessment, hear your story and be like, all right, here's a script. I would say that's the lowest bar. Some people obviously can do that accurately. Maybe they've seen thousands of patients over a few decades and, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, they kind of assess it that way. I would say there's a higher standard in terms of, at least because I'm trained as a psychologist, we use a lot of assessment tools. And so, especially if you're talking about younger kids, younger adults, you might use validated questionnaires to assess their symptomatology and compare that against a reference sample. So when you say, I have trouble paying attention, it's like, okay, let's fill out these 20 questionnaires and let's compare you to, hundreds, if not thousands of other people on this and see where you lie to see if you are probably clinically impaired or not. And it may be even useful to ask that of other people. So in kids, for instance, we'd have the parents and the teachers also fill out that same questionnaire to make sure that, if someone may not be aware of their own inattentiveness or hyperactivity, their teacher certainly knows if they're hyperactive in class. And so you triangulate those 3 points of data and say, okay, so we see a consistent pattern of symptom reporting that may be indicative of ADHD. So that's I think a little bit of a higher bar. But in my opinion, the gold standard for an ADHD diagnosis is what's called neuropsychological testing or neuropsych testing. It is expensive, unfortunately, but it's also the most definitive. Like if you truly want to know, if I wanted to know or I want to refer, a family or friend and say, I want to know for sure that they have ADHD and it's not something else. Because a lot of times, for instance, anxiety, a high level of anxiety that's not managed well, can manifest as difficulty paying attention. In fact, attentional difficulties are symptoms of a lot of anxiety disorders. So you really want sometimes a good differential diagnosis to make sure that is the reason that you're having trouble concentrating or pay attention because you're depressed and you're getting over a breakup. It's because you have generalized anxiety disorder and your cortisol levels are through the roof and that may be interfering with your ability to pay attention. Or is it true sort of ADHD? And that's why getting a really good history is helpful. Neuropsychological testing involves actual tests. Sometimes they're computerized tests. So for instance, it'll be like, a dot will show up on the screen. You have to press a button in a certain period of time, and it tests your ability to essentially like pay attention and sustain your attention, doing a really boring task, for a prolonged period, and other similar tests to that. And it's a kind of a battery. It's a battery of multiple tests. So for instance, they might do a test where they're, assessing your intelligence levels, your levels on like, verbal and mathematical performance. And they might see, oh, this person is actually really intelligent, right? But they're underperforming in school. And if you see that discrepancy and there's other indications, you might understand why there is. So another example is some of the reasons sometimes people may be struggling in school is because of a learning disability, not necessarily because of ADHD. They may have dyslexia, for instance, or they may have some reading comprehension problems. So for instance, when I would do ADHD neuropsychological assessments in kids, adolescents, and even college students, like we'd have them do like a reading comprehension test and say, okay, you got to read this passage, you got to answer these questions, you have 15 minutes, so you're under a little bit of time pressure, because that's obviously a very good proxy for taking the SATs, GREs, GMAT, or whatever exams that you have to do in real life in order to perform. And so if you can't do that, then it's a useful indication of like, oh, you have a reading comprehension problem. It's not ADHD per se. So to me, that's the best and most valid way. Unfortunately, it costs a few $1,000s to do a neuropsych battery. It can be covered by your insurance if you have good insurance. If not, unfortunately, people do pay a lot out of pocket to do so if they have the resources. But I would say that's the best and most definitive way because it'll much more conclusively tell you if you have ADHD and also tell you if you might have other problems that may be contributing if you are really struggling. So I know that's not directly asking about an Adderall alternative, but look, as a psychologist, I really think it's important to focus on the root cause and make sure that if you do have a problem, you know you have a true problem, and two, you know what problem you have before you go and try to medicate it away, whether it's with a supplement or a medication. So I think that's the really key thing is we always say as clinicians, and I train clinicians, I train psychiatrists at the UCSF School of Medicine, the first thing we always teach them is, look, you really have to do a really good differential diagnosis and case conceptualization in order to come up with an individualized treatment plan. You can't treat what you don't know what's going on. Otherwise, I think it's really irresponsible medicine to just be like, oh, you're having trouble paying attention? Throw some Adderall at you. By the way, one thing I wanted to tell people too, and you hear this a lot from people, unfortunately, Adderall is very highly abused. There's a lot of people who their first experience with Adderall is not through a legitimate prescription. People have prescriptions that they've gotten legitimately or illegitimately, and they pass it around to their friends, oftentimes because they have a deadline or exam they need to do. And they're like, okay, let me get some Adderall to, write this essay or study for this exam. And then they report, oh my God, my attention is so much better on Adderall, or I can handle this pressure of procrastinating the night before so much better, or stay up later and pull an all-nighter. It must mean I have ADHD. And the thing I wanted to emphasize is that is absolutely not true. Just because you respond to a stimulant does not diagnostically accurate per se in terms of definitively telling you that you have ADHD. I think a lot of people, quite frankly, unless they're anxious, perform better on a stimulant. That's why the number one drug that's used in the world is caffeine, right? Obviously, majority of Americans all around, or adults all around the world do not have ADHD, but a lot of people say, at least they say or feel that they report better using caffeine. So make sure that you're not kind of confusing the two. I think kind of the difference, the more often clinical picture that I see is, a lot of people when they're doing difficult sort of tasks, benefit from a stimulant in order to, whether it's boost their dopamine or their norepinephrine levels in order to be able to focus. The thing that I see with ADHD is that they have a really hard time with like really simple tasks, like even cleaning. That's why they like often disorganized, have messy rooms, other things that are quite frankly boring. The tolerance of boredom is very low in ADHD, and so they often have very disorganized, very chaotic lives. Sometimes impairments in short term memory, forget things all the time. But I think that's why it's useful to go get a clinical diagnosis. So, all that being said, the other reason it's useful is if you do have ADHD and it's clinically significant, then you can get a legitimate physician or psychiatrist, ideally, to prescribe you ADHD. And then you don't have to go look for an Adderall alternative because maybe Adderall is the best thing for you if the physician decides to do so. By the way, there are many other ADHD medications besides Adderall. There are other forms of it, prodrugs forms of it like Vyvanse. There are other forms like Ritalin or methylphenidate that are a little bit more norepinephrine focused, less dopaminergic. There are different, more pure forms of Adderall like dexedrine, which is just the dexo amphetamine isomer, while Adderall is actually 4 different types of amphetamine that are mixed together. So that's also why it's really beneficial to work with a physician to figure out what's the right medication, what's the right dosage too. Like not only just based on your weight, some people are just very, sensitive to these medications. It can make you anxious. It can increase your heart rate. It can make you sweaty. If you ever had a caffeine overdose, you know what that feels like. So it can be very helpful to do that. I would say if you're not going to go the medical route, like you're not going to bother getting a proper diagnosis by a physician, even though I encourage it. I understand sometimes time or practicality is not there. I think caffeine is the most used, relatively safe stimulant in the world. There's lots of other over-the-counter stimulants, but I think just from a practicality point of view and safety point of view, I would stick to caffeine if I was going to use a stimulant. There's also some interesting benefits if you're getting it from coffee or tea, right? If you're getting a naturally derived source of caffeine, make sure your coffee is filtered though. It does seem to have some other health benefits. It's not the caffeine that's beneficial, but it may be the other antioxidants or other chemicals or phytochemicals that's in coffee. Same thing, green tea has L-theanine, has a chemical called ECGC that may be having some other benefits as well. I actually personally like tea better than coffee. It's less jittery because of the presence of L-theanine, which is an amino acid that counterbalances the effect of coffee. In fact, I actually recommend folks, if they are consuming coffee, especially high doses of it, I'm talking about more than 1 cup a day, you may want to, although consult with your physician, this is not a medical advice, consider taking 200 milligrams of L-theanine because it helps smooth out the caffeine experience. It feels less what we call peripheral stimulation, meaning the jitteriness that a lot of people experience. It kind of tones that down. I think I might have shared the story previously that when I was actually doing my internship or residency training, I would drink a big cup of black tea before we have our weekly intern basketball game. And I realized it totally threw off my shot because it made my hand just jittery enough that it would actually literally impair my sports performance. That's why even surgeons are very careful about the amount of caffeine they consume because it gives you a very slight hand tremor, which obviously if you're operating on someone you don't want to have. There's a difference if someone has a tolerance to it, meaning if they're a daily caffeine user, some of those side effects in terms of tremor and the diuretic effects in terms of going to the bathroom more often tend to disappear because your body kind of gets used to it. But I think a really good white or green tea or matcha seems to have other salubrious or health benefits as well. So, I think that's the best way to go. And the nice thing about tea is it already has the L-theanine in it. It's a natural constituent of the tea, so you don't have to take an additional supplement. So that's probably the safest place that I would go. And finally, third recommendation is I would actually also encourage you to consider behavioral techniques. If you're having trouble concentrating or doing well at school, I know the tendency is to immediately want to take a pill, which if you're understimulated or may benefit from a stimulant could be helpful. But I would also, encourage you to see if behavioral techniques can improve your ability to sustain attention too. So if people are familiar with Pomodoro, It's a very simple technique. I think the original Pomodoro method is that you work or study for 20 minutes and then take a 10-minute break. There's variations of it. I really like using 50-10 for two reasons. One, there was a very large data analysis done by an app called Rescue Time, which basically like monitors how you use your computer and found that the average amount of time people could concentrate was about 52 minutes. So one, it seems to be for at least the majority of people about the time that you can sustain focus. And second, it fits nicely into an hour-long window. So study or work for 50 minutes, then take a 10-minute break. That's what we literally do at our company, Maximus, too, is we try to schedule 50-minute meetings and then a 10-minute break so that we can get up, walk around. So that's the main thing I would encourage, if you're a student or an employee, is try to work almost like in intervals, just like you're doing like an interval training. Work for 25 minutes, get up, get away from your desk, take a 5-minute walk, or study or work for 50 minutes, take a 10-minute walk, and do this interval. I would say, the shorter one's 8 times, the longer one 4 times, because the reality is most people realistically can concentrate for no more than 4 hours in a day, especially if you're talking about studying and memorizing, right? That's very kind of resource intensive in terms of the cognitive demand that it takes. It's a different story if you're working obviously full time as an employee and you're churning through emails, you're splitting your time between meetings, you're writing some documents. Then you can obviously work 8, 10, 12 hours a day because there's a variety of different work and obviously you don't need to remember it all. But if you're studying, I would say, and it sounds like the original question came from a student, I would say if you can get 4 hours of focused studying, and realistically, and when I'm talking four, I'm talking like three and a half of actual studying plus 30 to 60 minutes of those breaks that I enumerated, you're actually going to be way ahead of the curve than most of your peers and colleagues. Obviously, if you have to go do sections and labs and other things, that's a different story. But I'm talking about sitting down, concentrating, memorizing, so that you can, share that on an exam. Then that's what I would go for. So be realistic about the amount of time too. I don't think it's realistic for people to study 8, 10, 12 hours a day. It's a different story if you're cramming last minute before a final. Obviously, though, that's not encouraged. It'd be better. And in fact, there's research that shows that if you did 3 days of 4 hours of studying, it's better than studying 12 hours the day before. And it's also going to be much less stressful and painful. And you may not need Adderall because you can do it for 4 hours over 3 days rather than, quite frankly, you may need Adderall if you need to try to study or do 12 hours of an essay in one day because you're asking your body or your brain to do something that, quite frankly, is superhuman. So don't skip the behavioral stuff first. I think it's complementary with pharmacology. I'm not anti-pharmacology at all. I, in fact, use drugs and supplements myself. But you want to pair it with the behavioral stuff because it's often synergistic, and you're going to get the best bang for your buck if you kind of use all the different tools at your disposal.
Cool. I have a question, Cam. So I'd love to hear your take on how to be supportive as a friend.
Yeah, that's a great question. Is it maybe it'd be helpful if you fill in a little bit of context, like what situation are we talking about in order to be supportive?
Let's say they were just rejected by a company they were interviewing for.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Yeah. So yeah, common situation, particularly if you work in Silicon Valley and you're interviewing for a new job. Yeah. So I mean, I think the first thing that I think is very useful and underappreciated is to just validate the person and listen. I think people underappreciate the value of what we call active listening, right? So listening does not mean just like sitting there shutting up and not saying anything, right? Active listening is making the person feel heard. And you can obviously do that by your body language, right? When you're listening to someone, you're like providing direct eye contact, you're nodding, right? And often in a cadence that shows that you're listening. And there may be obviously points at which you're not interrupting them, but you're acknowledging what they're saying by saying, mm-hmm, sure, yep. And so it shows or demonstrates, that you're kind of attuned with them. So that's the first thing that I would always emphasize is if someone, you're catching up with a buddy and they're like, oh man, I just got rejected from this company. I'd be like, yeah, man, sorry to hear that. Tell me about it, right? Tell me the story of what happened. And then like, oh man, you wouldn't believe what I just went through. And I'm like, yeah, I'm here to hear. I'm here to listen. So I think just giving people a space to share and vent, especially if it's like a negative or traumatic kind of thing that they just went through. Obviously, rejection stings for most people. I think anyone who has a healthy sense of self-esteem, it stings the ego to get sort of rejected, and so to just sit there and be able to listen to someone makes a big difference. So that's step number one. Step number two, I think it's very useful to validate that person, right? So once you listen to them, you understand what their experience of that is. And by the way, this is why it's incredibly useful to listen first before you validate. Because if someone just said, "Hey, man, I just applied for a job and I didn't get it," you could say, "Oh man, that sucks. That was terrible," in an attempt to validate them. But you haven't heard them out yet, and that may be how they feel. In fact, it's probably how they feel because you're assuming they wanted the job if they applied for it. But if you heard their story, maybe they might tell you an interesting story. They might be like, "Oh man, I didn't even really want that job. I was just applying for it for a backup, or my parents were pressuring me to do it because it's a FANG company and it's prestigious for their son to work at Google. But I'm actually kind of relieved I didn't get the job." So obviously, if you're saying, "Oh, that sucks," and they're like, "I'm relieved," then your validation or your feedback is actually not accurately in line with how they truly feel. So that's why I actually think before you jump into validation, unless you obviously got from their first sentence how they feel, they could obviously be like sad, despondent, crying, angry, whatever, and then it may be appropriate if it's very clear that they feel negative, you'd be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that does suck," right? So use your emotional best judgment about when to do it. But if it's not clear at the beginning, you may want to just listen a little bit first to understanding and hearing them out so that you can validate appropriately that one, it's negative, but also to the degree or the volume that's appropriate to them. They may be mildly broken up by it. They may be moderately broken up by it. They may be heartbroken because that was the company that they had been dreaming of joining. Maybe they'd like grow up, for 5 years thinking that they're going to join Google, and yeah, they may be despondent over it. So you want your validation to be in line with their emotions, because then you're almost like mirroring them in terms of your mirror neurons in a accurate and appropriate way. So that's what I would say. And then, yeah, in the process of validation, you want to validate in a way, I would say, that's very genuine, right? I think the challenge is, because I train like psychiatry residents, it can be very easy to go through the motions and say, "Oh, yeah, I hear you. You got rejected from that company. Yeah, that sucks. That's terrible." But obviously, if I'm kind of exaggerating in terms of how monotone it is, but if it sounds like you're just saying it for the sake of saying it, in terms of, "Oh, okay, this is the right thing to say," or "this is what I think I should say as a good friend," it's not going to come across as genuine or validating, because it's like, "Okay, I appreciate that, you're like, looking out for me or trying to validate me," but it just doesn't land on an emotional level the same way as if I really sat there and heard you and actively listened, and I tried to put myself in your shoes, and I'd be like, "Man, maybe I don't want to apply for a job right now, but I can imagine, I remember what it was like to apply for a job, maybe a different job that I really wanted. And did I ever get rejected? Yeah, I got rejected for a job. How did that make me feel? And how could that help me sort of empathize with your experience?" And I think what that does is when you really listen and you really try to understand why someone is feeling the way that they do, and even if you don't necessarily agree with them, you could understand why they feel that way, right? Because it could be based on, you could try to empathize based on your own experiences, but also empathy, remember, really means understanding, right? Understanding means you might also understand that the person that you're talking to has different thoughts, different feelings, different values to you. So something that may not be a big deal for you, and you'd be like, "Oh, whatever, move on. It's not a big deal. You'll get them. There's many more fish in the sea. There's many other jobs you can have." For them, it's like, "No, this was my great hope. There's a lot of pressure. I have financial pressure. There's a lot of other reasons that may not apply to you." But you could be like, "Oh, okay, this person's in a different situation. They have a different mindset. They're a different person. So I can appreciate that. I can understand that. And I could really feel that." And so what I think happens is when you have that cognitive empathy, right, that understanding of what someone's going through, it oftentimes, not always, but there's various impairments we could talk about, can trickle down into a little bit more of an affective or an emotional empathy, so that you feel their pain a little bit, right? And that's what sometimes people call sympathy, right? Sympathy is a little bit more, to me, the emotional experience of I feel their pain and I feel a compassion to want to share that with them. And so I find, especially in training clinicians, but I think it applies to friends too, is when you do that process of really empathizing, both on an intellectual level, but also on an emotional level, your validation comes across as so much more genuine, right? Versus like, oh, that sucks. You might sit there and say, oh man, Darwin, I know how long you've been, looking for the right job. I know how much effort you've been putting into prepping for these interviews. I know these whiteboard exercises that you've had to do, or these coding challenges that you've prepared for. You put so much blood, sweat, tears into this. And I can understand why it really hurts that you didn't get that job. And I know how smart you are, and I know how deserving you are of this. So I'm sorry, bud. That really sucks. So see, when I obviously said it like that, it comes across very differently, because when I said that, there is a genuineness in what I say, because supposing that's the situation, that's my truth, and that's my conveyance of the truth to you, and hopefully that lands in a way that comes across as genuine to the other person. So that's what I would say in terms of a situation. And then obviously there's more if you're talking about advice giving and stuff. But I would say before you jump to advice giving, just hear people out, just listen, just really try to empathize intellectually and emotionally, and try to just validate how they feel. Because I think for most of the time when people are going through a hard time, 80% I would say of the time, what most people want is just to feel heard and just to feel validated. They don't even necessarily want or need any advice. And in fact, it's the premature advice giving that invalidates people, because they're saying, oh, okay, you don't really care how I feel. You're just trying to fix it, right? That's actually the biggest problem, by the way, guys have in talking to women, or especially their romantic partners, is, they'll come home. They're like, oh, you wouldn't believe what happened to me at work. And they're coming in trying to fix it. Be like, well, why don't you go talk to this person? Why don't you do this? And they're like, no, honey, I just want you to hear me, and I want you to validate that I had a terrible day. And that's what they really want. So if you're not sure if people want that, I would say, first of all, just default to listening and validation. You're going to be right 80% of the time. If you're not sure, or you want to maybe give advice because you think it'd be very pertinent, it's useful to ask. So what I would do is I would listen, I would validate, and then maybe as a third step, ask, okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that with me. Would it be helpful for you if I shared, my perspective or my thoughts? Or would you prefer that I just kind of, listen and commiserate with you and grab some beers and drown our sorrows? And, it'll go both ways. I've definitely had people, when I've done that, they're like, no, I just, I don't need any advice. I just wanted to commiserate. I know it'll be better. I'll apply for more jobs and I'll be okay. But I appreciate you listening to me. Or other people might be like, no, something I'm doing is not working. I am not able to get the job I want. Yeah, if you have any advice, I am all ears. But I think it's, even if they want your advice, it's an act of respect to ask people and say, hey, are you open for me giving you advice? And by the way, I literally do this in my private practice. People pay me thousands of dollars to work with them. And you think they would be like, oh my God, I've hired you, I'm paying you, like, give me the advice. Even with them, I still ask them, because psychologists actually are not in the advice giving business. We try to give people frameworks for them to make their own decisions. Unless it's like a clear, they're going to harm themselves or harm someone else, we'll tell them not to obviously stop it. But I will, even with my clients, I will ask them, especially if it's business issues, they'll describe the situation. I'll listen, I'll validate. I might ask kind of questions to help them think through it or give them a framework to make the decision on their own. But I might ask them, if I think it's very pertinent or helpful, would it be helpful for me to write now to give you my opinion or my advice? And sometimes they're always surprised. They're like, yeah, like, what else am I paying you for? But the moment I say it, it makes them feel respected to be like, oh, I'm not just jumping in and trying to solve the problem. And I'm, getting their approval to give them advice. Because for me as a psychologist, it actually is kind of going outside of the norm to give advice. And so I always ask out of a politeness and respect to my clients. And I actually think that's very applicable to friends as well. The moment you ask people for advice, even if they want it, they will appreciate your advice more, and they're more likely to take it because you kind of honored them by asking their permission first. So that's kind of the third and final step. Is that helpful, Darwin?
Thank you. In particular, I thought that was a really great example of validation. That's really cool. Going into like the history of, I know you've been doing this and, and so on. I'll skip ahead because you did it already and you're still a great person. Cool. That was very helpful. If you have the bandwidth, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on advice in general. Is critical advice, is there a space for it in friendship? Or is that something that well, how does it fit into a friendship?
Yeah, that's also a great question because yeah, the boundaries are different obviously in friendship and therapy. Like I try not to actually give too much advice in the context of therapy unless it's asked for, or like I said, I asked permission. That's a different sort of circumstance. Friendship is obviously more nebulous and depends on the type of friendship that you have, how close you are with that person, and the type of relationship that it is. Most friendships are peer relationships. You're often the same age, similar education, similar background. So, but obviously there are types of friendships where could be an older brother, older cousin, older kind of mentor that you have that's a little bit unequal, but it's not in a bad way. Some people like being mentored and some people really like mentoring. I've certainly had, I would say, friendships and relationships where I was much younger or much older. And I definitely got advice from that person or gave advice to another person. So I think it is appropriate. I think it just depends on kind of the norms and what the expectations are in that friendship. But I think it's definitely much more common than I would say in a psychotherapeutic context. And in fact, it's a lot of where people get their advice, right? If you think about like dating and relationships, who do you ask for advice? It's actually oftentimes not your therapist, unless you're in one. I would say the majority of people, unfortunately, don't have a therapist. It is very useful, I would say, especially if you're dealing with relationship stuff and it's not working out, to ask them because they have a lot of good context and a lot of frameworks like attachment styles and may explain why you're being really avoidant or being really anxious. But a lot of people obviously ask their friends for advice, like, what do I text this girl, etc. And hopefully your friends give good advice. But I think it's totally appropriate to ask your friends for advice, or give advice, like I said, if it's well received. The one thing I might add, though, and one thing I might encourage is I think, in fact, part of the mistake people make is they have a very homogenous group of friends or close friends. And the advice that they give, it's not that it's necessarily bad when it's someone literally same age, similar background, etc. They obviously get you. They can relate to you in terms of the empathy that we were talking about. They may be able to do that better than other people as a result of being similar to you. But on the other hand, like if you're a 25-year-old and you're asking another 25-year-old for career advice or like marriage advice who's also single or just they're in their first job, maybe they'll get good advice, but a lot of people don't have the life context in order to do that. So it may be actually useful. I would encourage people to actually sometimes have a diverse group of friends so that, especially when it comes to certain issues, that you can ask people who've been there before or may have a different level of depth and expertise. Like for instance, actually, as a psychologist, like I've literally spent probably over 10,000 hours one-on-one with people. So I have a lot of context in all kinds of different places: San Diego, LA, Chicago, San Francisco, from homeless people to CEOs, and there's a lot of context that comes with that. And it's the same thing if you talk to someone 5-10 years older, or certainly someone who's been through multiple careers, maybe multiple relationships, has been married, has had kids, etc. They can often provide a greater source of reference. And unfortunately, I think that's one of the things that's sadly missing in modern society. We're so kind of focused on our sibling society, kind of a peer-based friendship model. We don't have, I think, the diversity of friends and even family members and relationships that we did before, in terms of older brothers, older cousins, uncles even. In fact, I posted on Twitter today this video clip from this animated series Avatar of this uncle, right, who's advising this younger man and like sharing his wisdom. And I was like, that's, I loved watching the clip, but it also made me a little bit sad because I was like, where are the uncles these days? Where are the older brothers? Where are the older cousins that are providing that mentorship and the wisdom? So on this note, this is exactly why we're doing this program, right? I wouldn't say I'm a father figure, but I'm certainly a brother figure to a lot of men out there, and that I can provide this kind of guidance and advice over this weekly call-in radio show. But it's also a great opportunity in our communities on Discord and Facebook to do the same thing. So if that's something that you feel, if that resonated with you, of something in your life that you may be missing and you'd benefit from, and like it's like all your friends are kind of the same or similar age groups, similar backgrounds, grew up in the same place, this is a great place to diversify. We have over 1,000 men in our communities, and we're putting people into small squads of about 10 people each, that are pretty diverse. They're all over the country, different ages, different backgrounds, different points of view. And it provides a lot more diversity. So if you're trying to become a software engineer, we got software engineers that can counsel you on that. If you have questions about, stock trading, we have guys who run hedge funds who can give you a lot of inside scoop on, in perspective about money management and things like that. Or if it's like, yeah, man, you want some dating advice or career advice from someone who's about 10, 15 years ahead of you and has been in your shoes and has a little bit of perspective that they can share in hindsight. We have members of our community for that too. So that's why we call it Maximus Tribe. It is really an extended tribe of 1,000 great people that you can draw on. And if you ask a question, there's someone out there that can provide that for you. So obviously it's not a replacement for close friends. You should have close friends that you know in real life that you can shake their hand and hug, and obviously in a COVID safe way in these day and age. But I think having a digital tribe of people at your back is tremendously beneficial as well, and can provide you with a more diversified set of advice that can be helpful. So funnily, we talk about this with managing your money. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. Every competent money manager would tell you need to diversify your portfolio. Don't put it all in crypto. Spread it out into various things, real estate, 401ks, etc. And I think it's the same with your advice. You shouldn't just get it from whether it's your parents, your partner, your therapist, your best friend. You should have multiple sources of people that you can go, not only for different advice, but maybe you even ask the same thing to 3 different people and they'll probably give you 3 different pieces of advice. But at least you can take that, use your best judgment, take what's useful and leave the rest. So a very important thing to advocate in this day and age. I think people who have heterogeneous or diversified groups and networks are often going to do the best, because they can get both deep expertise, because your group of 5 friends is not going to be an expert in everything, but there's someone out of 1,000 who is. And second, they're just going to have different life experiences and perspectives that they can share with you when you have people from literally all over the world who are listening here and part of our community.
Awesome, thank you. I think that was you make a lot of really good points. The diversity of opinion thing was really, really cool. I think you're right. We don't make friends outside of our peer groups, and that should change. I'm in Squad 2, so if you want to get into software engineering, that is my jam. So hit me up. So I'm actually looking for a mentee. I'm also looking for a mentor, because I'm trying to crack the management ladder, and so get me up there. Other than that, thanks. You're a great brother.
Thank you. I appreciate it. By the way, I'm really glad that you've joined our squad. Can you tell our listeners in our community, so it's not just me promoting it, what's your experience been? And you can be totally honest, by the way, in terms of your experience. But so far, I'm just kind of curious. Why did you join the squads? How have they been so far? What's your experience like, so other people can, understand the benefits?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so I just really liked the idea of the accountability squad. I guess I didn't want to spray my friends with everything. So it's sort of excess accountability that I needed. And I also just liked the structure. Everyone's on the same page. I don't have to bring anyone up to speed. And I do love giving encouragement to people. I love calling out the things that I see that are going well. I am a manager, so I enjoy doing that. So yeah, I guess part of it, I'm not really using it that much for accountability, but I'm just there to just look for great things and point it out and encourage people, sort of. But I'm sure I'll think of things in the future. I used it to get started with yoga.
Awesome. How's that going?
It's going well. It's like one pose. It's malasana. That is the garland pose. It's a squat. I just do it for 40 seconds, and there's a huge return off of just that one pose. Let me give you a visualization on how it feels. I also couple it with belly breathing, breathing into the belly, which apparently is how babies breathe, and it's a very relaxed way and relaxing way of breathing. But the way it feels physically is there's fluid of heat rushing up into my brain to the point where I actually have to turn off the heat if it's on. If you a further visualization I would give to show people how this one pose done for 40 seconds feels is like if you've ever seen Dragon Ball Z and like Goku just goes Super Saiyan. It doesn't work all the time, but sometimes you just go Super Saiyan off of that one pose. And I'm starting to add other poses as I understand them because in my experience, if you don't do them properly, they're just exercise. They're not achieving the intended effect.
Yeah, that's a great example, right? So you're bringing up an example of a health behavior, right? To do yoga or a particular pose of it, which is especially what I think accountability groups are useful for. So especially because it was just the new year not too long ago. One of the things that we advocate is if you are trying to make health behavior changes, whether that's your exercise in terms of doing yoga or any other type of physical activity, you're trying to make dietary changes to improve your nutrition, you're trying to sleep more. You want to improve your focus, as we talked a lot about improving attention today, or your intimate relationships, because you want to be a better listener, give better validation or better feedback, as we talked about. These are great groups in order to improve your accountability on those things. So that's a great reason to do it. But I also love the fact, by the way, that you mentioned that you like it not just for the benefits that you get as a participant in terms of obviously having a group of men that can help keep you accountable to doing that practice on a regular basis. But I love the fact that you said, I like to give encouragement as well. That's such a valuable thing. We always talk about what you can get out of a group or get out of a practice. We never think as much about what we can give. And I actually, by the way, this is my experience with running groups at the VA. I used to run groups at the Veterans Administration Hospital with veterans all the time. They're often the most skeptical guys about groups because they're like often very macho, like literally ex-soldiers, right? And I would always tell them, go to one group, and if you don't like it, I'll never ask you to go to it again. 95% of the time, they'd go to one group. They see a peer group of people that they can relate to, other guys and women who served in the armed forces, and they would not only find themselves with a group of people who knows what it's like to be in their shoes, and obviously a very shared, tight-knit experience being in the military, but they actually often found benefit from exactly the same reason that you said, which is to help other people. So I had a lot of people who, for instance, I would run like chronic pain management groups, and they would get to a point where they were good, right? They're stable with their pain, they're managing it decently. They didn't really need to be in the group anymore for themselves, but they would stick around as kind of ironically, pun intended, veterans of the group, because they're like, I got a lot of benefit out of this, and I want others to benefit, and I want to be a good role model to other people too. So I'll stick around. And the VA was obviously happy to have them stick around and say, yeah, like help essentially become a group leader and mentor other people. And if you got benefit and now you're really good about your yoga practice, you're really good about your meditation practice like Bobby or other members of our community, now you can help other people and teach other people how to do it the same. And at the very least, if you're not teaching them, you can at least provide them with encouragement, because I think that's tremendously helpful. So it's such a beneficial thing, I think, to be in any sort of group-based practice, whether it's ours at Maximus or other people. It's such a lonely, isolating time right now during COVID, during quarantine. In fact, I was just reviewing some of the literature from Gallup, and they're saying, look, people are happiest when they spend 6 to 7 hours a day socializing. 6 to 7 hours. A lot of people obviously aren't doing that because of the circumstances right now. And so if you're not, and you can't do that in person, this is a great opportunity to do so, not only for yourself, but to make sure that other people aren't feeling lonely and isolated either. I find, quite frankly, the thing that increases both my well-being and the well-being of my clients is giving. There's nothing, honestly, that makes me feel happier than giving to other people, helping other people, supporting other people. Like when I finish a session with a client, when I do this call and radio show and get great feedback like we had last week. If you haven't heard show number 8, by the way, you should listen to this guy who instituted the Keystone Habit and talked about how it changed his life. He lost all this weight, lifts 5 days a week, wasn't publishing any papers in his PhD program. Now he's publishing 2 to 3 papers. And it was so rewarding for me to hear that totally spontaneously from this guy who called in and was like, I read your article years ago and it changed my life. And I was like, oh man, this is exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because, I want to alleviate people's suffering and make them, as optimal as possible in terms of their health and functioning. And so I'm obviously in a very privileged position to do that as a psychologist and professor because it's part of my job. But literally every single guy has the opportunity to do that as well in terms of participating in our community and our groups. So I know it's hard right now to go and volunteer and give back in that way, but you can do it here and now if you so choose, with Maximus. So thanks, Darwin, for that shout out and sharing your own experience and in being a part of that. And if you're interested, join our Discord. There's a little channel called Find a Squad, and Victor, our moderator, can place you in a squad if you're interested in participating. So with that note, we should wrap up. We've hit our hour time. So I just wanted to thank everyone who joined, especially the people who joined on Discord. Thank you so much for asking your questions live. Thank you for everyone who submitted the questions that were written. Hope you got a lot of benefit from that. And thanks everyone who's joining live on Instagram and YouTube Live as well. It's good to have some people who are joining those channels as well. If you want to continue the conversation, you can actually feel free, especially the people on Discord, you can hang out and talk to each other. I'm actually going to encourage that after the call and radio show. We're going to obviously turn off all the recordings, but just have people, if they want to connect and chat, we'll give them the option to do that. So you can stick around. Otherwise, you can find us in the Discord channels, and we'll have any follow-ups and feedbacks that we post, links of anything we talked about there. So have a happy Thursday, everyone. And one favor that I'm going to ask of the community, if you enjoy this call and radio show, we do put the recorded episodes up on Apple, Spotify, and other channels. So please be sure to leave a review. If you're going to leave a review anywhere, I recommend Apple because it's the canonical source that most people go to. So leave a 5-star review. And if you do, I promise I'll actually give you a shout out on next week's episode. So thank you very much, everyone. Have an amazing evening. Stay happy, stay healthy, and strength and honor.